You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, welcome to the Campus Podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Prynne, editor of Campus, and today we're exploring citizen science and participatory research as models to drive better research outcomes alongside public engagement. And we're going to do this by drawing on the insight of two prominent academics who are deeply engaged in this work on either side of the Atlantic. Now, interest in citizen science has grown rapidly in the last decade among both the public and academic researchers, and with it has come a proliferation of citizen science projects in which any of us could choose to get involved. These cover pretty much every discipline one could think of. Many have become household names. In the UK, we have the annual butterfly count, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, Asian Hornet Watch. To find out more about the benefits citizen science can bring to research and how to make it work on a practical level, I spoke to an academic who has done more to advance the cause of citizen science than almost anyone in the UK, Chris Lintott. A professor of astrophysics at the University of Oxford, Chris is also well known as a presenter on the BBC's long-running television show, The Sky at Night. He has published a number of books, most recently Our Accidental Universe, which came out last year, and he has a keen interest in public engagement more broadly. What may be less well known about Chris is that he is the co-founder of Zooniverse, which is really the go-to platform for listing citizen science projects. So it's an incredibly useful resource for academics wishing to generate interest and attract participants to their projects, but also for non-scholars who want to find research in which they could get involved. We had a great conversation in which Chris makes a powerful case for working with people outside academic circles to extend the potential of your research, but also bring in fresh perspectives. He also tackles some of the more common questions or challenges levelled at citizen science. But citizen science is just one model for engaging the public in research. There are many other approaches to working with individuals and communities outside academia, and all these can feed into the broader mission of public impact. This was very evident from my second conversation with Neeli Bendapudi, president of Pennsylvania State University, or Penn State, who has led the launch of a new coalition of university leaders across the US and Canada to advance community-engaged public impact research. She talks about why this group was set up and what it is working towards, outlining some of the key things needed to underpin more equitable and ethical public involvement in research. This conversation was really a call to action for research-focused institutions and individuals across North America to join her on this mission. But first, let's hear from Chris. Hi Chris, great to talk to you.
Yes, you too. Nice to be here.
Now, among your many academic hats, you are responsible for co-founding the platform for anyone wishing to launch or get involved with a citizen science project anywhere around the world. And that is, of course, Zooniverse. But I believe Zooniverse emerged out of an earlier citizen science-backed research project called Galaxy Zoo. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that, how that came about and developed.
Yeah, of course. I think it's always good practice to try and solve your own problems first. And that's what Galaxy Zoo was an attempt to do. I was a postdoc here in Oxford in 2007, faced with the problem of having too many images of galaxies. We had about 1 million images from a project called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And if you've got an image of a galaxy, you want to know what shape it is, because that tells you about its history, whether it's interacted with other galaxies, when and where it's formed stars, that sort of thing. A student here who took 50,000 of these images in what he described as a supremely tedious couple of weeks and sorted them out. But we had another 950,000 of these. And so, inspired by projects that took place in the States, particularly something called Stardust at Home, when NASA had people looking at dust grains that had been collected that went to a comet, we thought, well, if people will look at dust grains, maybe they'll look at our galaxies. And without really thinking too much about it, we kicked up a fairly basic website, asked people the simplest question that was useful, about the galaxy. Can you see spiral arms? And put it online. And I thought what would happen was that I'd give a talk to a bunch of amateur astronomers, and maybe 50 people would go home and do 50 classifications. But actually, it's very hard to succeed slowly on the web. It was true nearly 20 years ago. And within a day, we were getting 70,000 classifications per hour. The server crashed. We got out of the service that was giving us the images of galaxies because we hadn't bothered to tell those people. We got 18,000 emails on the first day, most of which said your website was down. But somehow out of that, we realized two things. One was that people collectively were very good at this sort of task. The results we got were better, both the machines and better than just a single student going through things. And second, there was this enormous desire to help. People were motivated. People who had no previous interest in astronomy were motivated by the idea that they could contribute something to science. And so those are the sort of founding things that led us to go on and build other projects and built out from Galaxy Zoo to what became the Zooniverse.
Wow, 70,000 classifications in an hour is actually quite hard to compute.
Yes, especially as we weren't ready for it as well. We hadn't really built the site to deal with that, and so it was a fun couple of months trying to sort that out. And I was a postdoc; I was supposed to be doing other things, and I remember sitting there thinking, "Okay, well, I guess this is what I have to do for my research now: is use this data that we were getting."
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what an amazing revelation to almost sort of stumble across and then be able to harness as you then moved forward in your academic career. So, as we've mentioned, Zooniverse then emerged out of this. Zooniverse, I believe, has been going since 2007.
Oh, well,
You know, that's
2007 was Galaxy Zoo.
oh, was
And
it?
then what
Okay.
happened was two things. One was it's sort of physicist does social science. So we were surprised by the response that we got to Galaxy Zoo. And so we thought maybe we'll try some other projects and see what works and what doesn't work in an effort to understand the dynamics that were happening with the crowd. So we started off building other astronomy projects. We did a crater counting project on the moon, and we did something in collaboration with the Royal Greenwich Observatory looking at material flowing from the sun out into the solar system. But we also found out that other researchers, we started to get emails and calls from other researchers who had millions of pictures of penguins or the output of a cell scanning microscope. And we realized there's a whole bunch of people who were suffering from this problem of having got very good at collecting data, but not so good at scaling up the analysis. And so we realized we could build a platform that would help us explore this notion of crowdsourcing of what we learned to call citizen science, but which also solved problems for lots of these other people who were in touch. I'm also somebody who's interested in everything, so it was great fun to end up in meetings with biologists and chemists and particle physicists and talk about their science as well.
Sort of interdisciplinarity before that became quite such a buzzword. You've mentioned the reason that citizen science, as we now call it, can be so helpful is that it just allows researchers to get through huge amounts of data that, I mean, there simply aren't enough hours in a day for one person to do on their own. The world has changed a lot over the course of Zooniverse's life, the digital tools that we now are able to use, communication channels and so on, and indeed, most recently, AI. Some might argue that with these tools, we can now crunch through all this data using machines. How do you think that affects the need for citizen science?
Well, I think it's obviously very important and interesting. So one thing to say is that the machine learning routines that people are generally talking about when they talk about AI, sort of generalized deep learning models, often require large training sets. And so there are a set of Zooniverse projects now that are explicit about the fact that what they're trying to do is collect a training set for, I don't know, recognizing giraffes in camera trap images or a particular kind of asteroid in images from a space telescope or whatever. And when you've got a large enough training set, the machines can take the strain, but you still need the human insight at the beginning. So that's sort of the boring answer to the question. We've also shown, incidentally, that while you have these big foundational models, things built by large companies to do trained on sort of, quote, the whole internet, to do general problems. Those do rather less well in scientific domains, where images are more specialized and don't look like the kind of thing you often find on Google. So there is still this need for specific training data. I think the more interesting thing is to think about the different capabilities of people and computers. So we've shown in some of the astronomy projects I've been involved in, for example, that combining human and machine classification outperforms either one on their own. And there's sort of this thread runs through the machine learning literature. For example, there's some fun studies that show that a great chess player will lose to a chess computer, but a good chess player with a chess computer can beat both the great player and the computer. That sort of human and machine combination is very powerful. And so we've run projects where we're actively choosing images, say, where the machine is uncertain or where the machine is certain but disagrees with a different machine learning routine. And we'll show those images, which tend to be the more interesting or weirder ones, to our volunteers. So that's sort of a win-win situation. I think the place where you see this clearest is and something that's become a focus of my own work, which is to try and find the really unusual things in large data sets. And it turns out there are lots of ways to ask an ML routine, an AI program, if you prefer, to find the most unusual things in a data set. They will almost always be boring. Places where the camera's malfunctioned, or in my world, where a bright star has got in the way, or one of Elon Musk's satellites has crossed the field. What you need the people to do is identify which things are interesting. And so you can imagine this split, and I think this is where we're going with lots of these projects, where machines are doing the bulk of the everyday work, but they're directed by citizen scientists to find the things that are interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It comes back to that idea of AI needing to be an assistant as opposed to a replacement, and really an extension of human expertise. And what you described there makes sense. I mean, it's refining the work, allowing the humans to be working on the most pertinent points.
Yeah. One thing I should say is that I'm talking like that's a very scientist-driven view of this. I think if you talk to some of the citizen scientists, there'd be a slightly different view, which is that for many of our volunteers, obviously they're driven by the need by their desire to participate and to be part of this. But these projects become hobbies for people as well. And so there have definitely been some difficult decisions where we've said, okay, this project's done now because the machines can take over, but our volunteers would like to still keep contributing. And so I think there is this sort of need to remember that these are projects with multiple goals. It's not just about sorting through the data. It's also about providing a shared experience of exploration. So we don't ever want to fake that, but maybe there could be places where we choose not to use machine learning because our volunteers are doing such a good job and want to keep doing that.
Yes, and surely one of the benefits of citizen science and engaging the public in research is to amplify knowledge and encourage enthusiasm for these subject areas. Another thing that I see questioned around citizen science is on a practical level. Cynics would say, scientists are trained in the scientific method and good research practices. So why would an untrained member of the public be a reliable research partner? You've already mentioned that the work done on Galaxy Zoo was of an excellent quality, but I wonder if you do have an answer to that question and how researchers can ensure that the data or the findings reported by non-scientists are accurate.
It's an important question, and it's particularly important when you get into things like environmental data or where people are using citizen science data to make decisions about the real world. It's slightly easier to convince people it doesn't matter if you're wrong if you're looking at a galaxy that's a few 100 million light years away. But I think, first off, I'd say that question misunderstands, and it's one I hear a lot, it's not criticism of you, but it misunderstands the nature of how science is done. If I use any method, if I sit and write a piece of code to analyze images or data that I've got, I need to demonstrate that that is reliable. So the checks that one would do on work done by myself or my team are the same that we do when we get data from citizen scientists. We need to really dig down and understand where the errors are, what's reliable, what isn't reliable. Many of our projects, we measure that directly. We can put in test images, the same as you would do actually for machine learning. So there's a whole infrastructure and a practice around ensuring data quality that goes back way before anything we're talking about. In astronomy, amateur astronomers have been monitoring the brightness of variable stars that change brightness for more than 100 years. And in that world, there's the concept of a personal equation, which is how you adjust the measurements given by one observer to match everyone else's. So there's a sort of data hygiene thing here, but I think more broadly, I do think that we found that volunteers can bring completely new perspectives, particularly in finding unusual and interesting things in our data set. We've often found that it's the volunteers who motivate us to look at questions that we would otherwise ignore. I'm sitting here going, right, I'm going to try and test cosmological simulations by labeling all these galaxies by shape. And our volunteers are saying, but this one looks like a penguin. Why does it look like a penguin? And that's just as interesting a scientific question. People have now done PhDs on the penguin galaxy. So I think you do get driven to a slightly different type of science, and that can only be a good thing, I think. A lot of the data sets that we're talking about are incredibly rich and can be explored in many different ways. So sometimes it's data verification, sometimes it really is a case of just exploration, and their sort of fresh eye can be really helpful.
Yeah, and with new perspectives come new ideas, come further innovation, really, and new ways of thinking about things. So it's a really salient point. I think many people are aware of those big citizen science initiatives like the big butterfly count or bird watch when people record the wildlife they see in, for instance, their gardens. But I wondered if you could point to any sort of really innovative or unusual ways you've seen researchers working with the public.
Yeah, I think I'll pick one from Zooniverse and one from elsewhere. So we have a project called Backyard Worlds, which is run by an astronomer called Mark Kushner, who works for NASA. And Backyard Worlds is a search for around our local neighborhood. So they're looking for faint nearby stars. We actually don't know all of the stars that are probably within the nearest thousand within the Milky Way because they're so faint. And it's a task like any other Zooniverse project. You could go online, you can start participating. But Mark and co have built a community out of that project. So volunteers both on their discussion forums, but then through telecons with the team and so on. The volunteers are really part of the science team. And the papers that get published are often led by volunteers. So I think that's a really interesting example of how you can encourage deep participation, how people who start off not being interested in astronomy find themselves a little later developing skills and writing a paper in the journal. And I think the Backyard Worlds team do a really, really good job of that. But I think it's also important to remember that that's not for everyone in the same way that just because you're interested in astronomy doesn't necessarily mean you want to take a physics degree and do that as a career. I think it's really important to keep a space for casual participation. And my favorite example of this is a project run out of Cardiff for many years, which is called Project Splatter, which asks people to report roadkill that they see as they drive around the UK. And it turns out that's a really good way of getting a census of the populations of many of the animals that live in across the country and in wild areas on either side of roads. So you couldn't be more casual than driving along and then sending a text message if you see something. But I really like that sort of moment of citizen science during something you're doing anyway is I think really important because the person participating in Project Splatter is as much of a scientist as the person writing a paper with the Backyard Worlds team. And I think, it's important to talk about both scales of participation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Do you think taking these projects as a whole, are they taken as seriously in academic circles as the more traditional controlled forms of research, and perhaps in terms of policy impact, for instance?
Yeah, well, again, I don't want to draw a distinction between sort of controlled research and citizen science because we're doing the same work to
Yeah,
demonstrate that the data is reliable that anyone else would be doing. It is true, I think, that, and again, this is sort of slightly beyond astronomy, but in policy areas, particularly in the US, there are controversies around citizen science data. There's a recent law in Louisiana, for example, that puts really stringent rules on how state agencies can take into account citizen science data, and that's I think that's an overreaction to a fear that isn't justified, really, that the sort of data is somehow not reliable because it comes from people. I think the gap between citizen science and policy There's been some great work out of the Judge Institute in Cambridge on this, who published a recent book on policy and citizen science. The gap isn't the data collection. The problem isn't getting reliable data. The problem is having access to policymakers once you've got that data. How do you, if you're a bunch of citizen scientists who are monitoring your water quality in your local river or using camera traps to monitor wildlife or something like that, how do you as a group get to policymakers? That's the hard bit. It's that jump through the scientific establishment that's the difficult thing. You can see some of this in, there's a story that's told about Flint in the US where there were horrible problems with the water supply and lead pipes that were decaying and so on. And the problems with that water supply were identified by citizen scientists very early on. And sometimes this is told as a success story for citizen science, but it was only when a university lab got involved and were able to take the same data, so not improve the reliability, but knew how to get that information into the policy process, that it became a political scandal. So I don't think it's about data quality. It's about communication and the gap to how we talk to policymakers. In astronomy even, it's that jump from people who've done often some quite sophisticated work, analysing a star or a potential planet that they found on one of our projects. The hard bit is the jump to writing a paper without a lot of support. And so we need to think, I think, about new ways of publishing, of new ways of communication from citizen scientists themselves without requiring them to cloak themselves in all the machinery of academia.
Of course, because they don't have access to all those same academic networks that would facilitate that. The language of academia, particularly in science research, can be quite impenetrable. How do you overcome this when bringing the public into research projects?
I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm somebody who's always done public engagement as part of their academic practice. So that sort of translation is something that's very important to me. I think it's not so much the language. I think one of the things I've learned in these projects is that in academia, we're very comfortable with not understanding. So if I pick up a paper and start reading it this morning, the odds of me understanding every word in that, even in my own specialism, are pretty low. But I know how to get the gist out of a paper and then go back and learn the things I need to learn if it proves to be interesting. That's very alien compared to how people are taught to, say, read a document in history at school or something, where you start at the top and you keep reading until you don't understand it. And so that sort of soft skill is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to pass over. And I think, it is an act of translation, but it's one that benefits both sides if we can find a way to talk without jargon. There are places that are very good at this. There's a huge library of work, for example, on patient engagement, where in the medical profession, there's an obvious and clear need to communicate directly and clearly with patients. But that's a citizen science interaction, and there's plenty that many of us can learn from that.
Finally, can you finish by just giving us your elevator pitch? What are the most powerful reasons we should all be supporting and taking part in more citizen science?
The world is more interesting if you spent a tiny part of your day helping discover things about it. So whether it's looking at plankton or distant galaxies, or spending time in the Serengeti via a camera trap, or getting a side hobby in cell biology or particle physics, I genuinely think it's good for the soul to do this stuff. And even I spend a few minutes a day working on a non-astronomy citizen science project just so I've got a taste of that as well. So I think try it. It really is something you can do in a few minutes via Zooniverse, and I think it changes how you view science and yourself. So I'd recommend it to anyone.
Well, what better reason than that? Thank you so much for your time, Chris. It's been great talking to you.
Take care.
So, if anyone was unsure about engaging the wider public in research, that conversation should serve to persuade you. One thing that stood out for me was the point Chris made that academics should be mindful of people's motivations for getting involved in these projects, and that sometimes there may be benefits to enabling the participants to actually continue their involvement in your research rather than focusing solely on efficiency and using an AI machine. This really speaks to me about the question of public outreach, as getting people enthused in your work will surely aid the impact you ultimately have. Which brings us nicely on to my conversation with Neeli Bendapudi, who clearly sees collaborating with communities outside academia on research as an absolutely essential component of what she calls public impact, i.e. research that serves the public good. Neeli started by talking about why she felt there was a need to push this particular agenda in US higher education. Hi Neeli, lovely to have you join us on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Miranda. I am truly looking forward to our conversation.
Fabulous. Well, I know you took over as president of Penn State in 2022, and this year you have become founding chair of a new coalition of university leaders from across the US committed to advancing public impact research that serves the greater good. This is called the President's and Chancellor's Council on Public Impact Research. Could you start by explaining the thinking behind this council and why you felt it was important to establish such a group?
Absolutely. I first want to clarify that the notion of universities having public impact is not new. Everything we do at universities, whether it is through our research, scholarship, creative endeavor, we hope has an impact, whether it's the basic sciences or the applied sciences, whether it's the humanities, arts, everything we do, we want to have a positive impact. But this particular convening, if you will, began actually in November 2023, when a group of us started talking about what do we do to make sure that universities are actively engaged in the communities that we serve, working side by side with the people impacted, our researchers impacting policy, what I like to call the messy side of research in many ways. It's not the clean work that might happen in a lab. From there, the conversations actually evolved with the Pew Charitable Trust. So I need to give them huge kudos. Earlier in the year in 23, Penn State had the opportunity, along with Pew, to do a convening at the White House in terms of evidenced impact. How do we make sure that the research we do in universities actually is used, translated, generalizable across multiple communities? From then on, this is a group of university presidents, as you said, and chancellors that represent public universities, private universities, rural, urban, minority serving institutions. But what is really critical here is that we're not working in silos. We're actually working with our funders. 80 of the largest funders are part of the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, with Pew Charitable Trust taking the lead. So I am doing this in partnership with that Transforming Evidence Funders Network and with a strong, broad coalition of our colleagues.
That makes perfect sense, that obviously the funding is so vital to making this work, that working together, that is the way forward. Now, it seems to me that we are talking about two sort of intersecting things here. So you mentioned the impact of research, public impact research, but also the fact that this involves working with those impacted, and that might be termed participatory research. I mean, there are many other labels you could give it. For those perhaps less familiar with this, could you briefly talk us through what you mean by these and how one feeds into the other?
You've brought up a very good point. Even the notion of public impact research is not new. Certainly, it's been called participatory research. If it is engaging directly with communities, it's called community engaged research. It could be technology commercialization. It could be work that informs policy. One way to think about the public impact research is usually tends to be interdisciplinary. The outcomes are not always neatly summarized only in peer-reviewed journals or the traditional metrics of success for an institution of higher education. So what we are trying to say is the sorts of research, it might be addressing homelessness among veterans. It might be, how do we work with the city to make sure that we shore up the coastline for climate change? It could be a variety of issues. And in fact, all of these are issues on which our researchers and others are working on. And it may not fit neatly into one discipline. The outcome may not just be, did you have a peer-reviewed journal that's published? It might be, what impact did you have in this community? And did you learn something that could then be generalizable to address this problem in the country or in the world? This is something that the funders are very interested in, Miranda. Increasingly, they are saying, we want to see how the work we are funding has more direct impact, immediate impact. So this is one part of it. But the pressure is not coming only from funders. As we look at our graduate students, undergraduate students, certainly graduate students, not all of them go directly into just another academic setting. If you look at the career pathways across the world, and certainly in the United States, more of them are going into policy work or agency work where they want to have impact. So how do we account for that? How do we support that? In fact, if I may simplify, the three things that we working together, it's also government agency I forgot to mention, is to really think about where is our system failing and where are we doing well? So to recognize both. Do we have the infrastructure to support this research? Do we have the right incentives in place to support this research? And do we have the culture in place to support this research? If you don't mind, let me add one more thing. This is about broadening the scope of the work we do. This is not taking away in any way from the research that we already do at universities, but saying to evolve. If you look at the crisis of confidence in higher education, maybe efforts like this will get more people involved in looking under the hood, being part of the solution, understanding how universities are such great agents for good, agents for change in the communities that we serve. And I mean that globally as well.
So it's really about the real world applications of research, which you rightly point out rarely fits into neat disciplinary brackets. It sounds like, from what you're saying, you're very much pushing at an open door where funders are concerned in terms of trying to drive this focus on real world impact forwards. Now, you have actually mentioned a few of the foundational blocks that need to be in place, but can you perhaps talk a bit more on those to someone listening to this at another institution who really wants to see kind of more community engaged public impact research within their university? How could they go about underpinning that? What changes would need to be made?
We're actually working on it together to say, none of us thinks we have easy solutions ready to roll. So we are actually giving ourselves 2 years to work together to come up with some robust recommendations, also to uplift the work that's already going on. That is very, very sound across right now, it's the United States, Canada. We had representatives from the UK in our first meeting. If somebody is listening to this, I hope they will reach out, because the group of individuals involved here is just to reach out to a larger ecosystem and say, let's work on it together. So the first might be infrastructure. Let's talk about, let us say you have faculty who are extraordinarily interested in addressing rural health. That's a huge issue. That's, again, coming from our university. And that might need disciplines like agriculture, medicine, nursing. It might be social work. There might be a variety of areas. Do you have the infrastructure to allow those researchers to come together? And what about infrastructure to make sure that they're able to make the right connections with the communities? Should not be, public impact research should not be, you fly into a community you've never been in before, and you say, we are the experts, and we are here to tell you what you ought to be doing. It ought to be respectful, mutually beneficial relationships for the long run. So do you have the infrastructure to support this community building? Public impact research also takes time precisely for that reason. So that might be something you want to think about. I'd also say maybe you have a researcher that has a project that has immense value, commercially or socially, are you helping them to be able to do that technology transfer? Finally, don't forget the policy work. So when we say public impact, the immediate work with communities comes readily to mind, but we are also thinking about commercialization. We're thinking about work that might impact public policy. Maybe there's great understanding, but do you have the infrastructure in place to get in front of the key legislators or the think tanks to be able to share your findings? So that's one example of infrastructure.
It sounds like there's a huge range that you're looking at here. You mentioned working with different communities on research, policy work, knowledge exchange was touched on there with tech transfer. You also touched on, potential challenges around the way the research is carried out. An obvious challenge to community engagement is unequal power dynamics, and researchers have been criticised in the past for sort of extractive research practice and so on. How can researchers ensure everyone involved in a research project is equally valued, but also feels equally valued?
I love that question. Thank you so much. That's a big part of what we are trying to focus on too. In all of these areas, if you think about the broad 3 areas that I laid out, these are forms of research that have impact, but it's not easy to evaluate them, unlike the traditional research of grants and peer-reviewed publications, which we value immensely, and at Penn State, we're incredibly proud of. So in a way, what you're talking about comes back to the incentives too. What kinds of incentives do we have in place? Are we actually making sure that people do the right thing? A big part of our council's work is to try to come up with an evaluative framework. So someone goes in and says, here, I did this research, I impacted this community. Do we just take their word for it? Or is there a way to hear from the community? What is their reaction? And is it sticky? You've done some intervention. Is it still in place? How much of it is just the Hawthorne effect? Like because someone came in and paid attention to that problem, maybe it went away temporarily. So those are the kinds of things we want to look at, Miranda. And in fact, when we talk about incentives, I would say one of the other things we need to do is how do we reward people that are doing the work, again, that's in an interdisciplinary space, when most journals might be more set up for evaluating excellence within a particular discipline. How do we encourage this? Because there's no question problems are getting more and more complex. So we need the interdisciplinarity alongside the disciplinary excellence.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And your point on incentives, it's definitely one of the other criticisms leveled at academia, that the way it is structured is such that it doesn't necessarily work in favor of certain types of research. So as you say, that needs addressing. At Penn State specifically, can you touch on what you're doing to support your own academics to engage more in this type of research?
At Penn State, we are very, very fortunate to have had a long history of this through our so many efforts, but certainly when you think of our evidence to impact collaborative, which is how I first started to engage with this, the whole idea there was, can we track and see what's happening in policy? So we're doing this work. Is it getting out there? Is it having an impact? How do we bridge that gap? Also, because we are a land-grant university, the lone land-grant university in Pennsylvania, for our listeners who may not be as familiar with what is a land-grant university, this goes back to 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, when President Lincoln signs the Morrill Act to say higher education should not be just for the elites, but accessible to the sons and daughters of the working class, as it was put at the time. Maybe it was just sons of the working class, now that I think about it. But the point is, we are in every single county in the state through our extension offices. We have that mindset of, are we solving problems for the community? That's why we were created. Specifically, the lands granted sometimes taken, as you know, not always granted. But the idea behind it was, how do we solve problems for our state? So that's part and parcel of who we are. And at Penn State, our land grant mission is very critical. Through our outreach mission, they've started something called the Keystone Collective Impact. Research is very strong, but the two areas I'm highlighting are through our outreach efforts as well as the policy work. And for a minute, if I switch to research, impact has always been critical to us, and we are very grateful for the global impact that you all do. Thank you. By my count, we're 57 out of 1,963 universities or something. So that puts us in the top 3% worldwide for the impact of the work we do. So we think we bring some credibility to this space, that the work we do should have an impact. You asked for how are we supporting. We've launched the President's Public Impact Research Awards because, again, traditional incentives are not really geared towards this. So we're trying to highlight faculty who work often in this space. That's the other beauty of it. They're not just working with communities. They almost always engage our students in research, which is even better, undergraduate and graduate students. So to give you one example of what I mean by research that has a public impact that ought to be uplifted, we are very, very proud of the work of Professor John Morrow and the lion glass. So again, I encourage people to check out what this is. The glass that you use on your the cell phones, I guess, if you look at it, this glass, lion glass, that's Gorilla Glass on most of our phones. Lion glass is going to be 10 times stronger and use half as much energy to produce. So recently, they secured a partner for product development. Think of how that could change the world. If we could have glass that is stronger, less resistant to breakage, and uses significantly less energy to produce in terms of impact on climate. We need to be telling those stories, and this is not new. By no means are we trying to say no one has ever thought of it. This has been important. We're just trying to shine a bright light on this area and saying, institutions of higher education, let's embrace this as well, along with our basic research, with our applied research, our traditional research. And just, if I may, we are not doing this ignoring that traditional work, because this past year at Penn State was a record-breaking year in research expenditures, over $1.337 billion. And in terms of external grant and contract expenditures, we, again, for the first time in our history, we topped $1 billion in external grants. It was something like 11% year-over-year increase. I hope I'm not sounding defensive when I mention this, Miranda, but the reason I say that is often when we talk to our peers or faculty members about let's also really highlight public impact research, there's a fear that it's a false binary, but there's a fear that we're saying this is in place of our traditional measures of excellence. Not at all. We are saying we need to expand the tent because that's good for universities, not to just be viewed as esoteric, inaccessible, something that's happening in the ivory tower. It's responsive to our students, increasingly who are going into fields outside of higher education. And it's certainly responsive to funders. And I believe it's also very good for society, because engaging in this sort of research is much more interesting and accessible to an undergraduate student, for example, to start coming in and saying, oh, the work I do, I can see the immediate impact.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's relatable, isn't it? Which is always going to give it greater potency. I wanted to say, when you said, I hope I don't sound defensive, not at all. Funnily enough, I was going to come on to that very point and say, is there a danger that applied research then gets shifted to the sidelines? And so I think it's a really, really pertinent point you've made. There is always a fear in higher education systems the world over Certainly in the UK, there are concerns that there's a huge increasing focus on impact and what's that going to do to more esoteric forms of research. So actually, it's really important that you do proactively point out that the two are not mutually exclusive. I think many researchers will be very pleased to hear that.
Two things that I want to say thank you for. One is you're right, because I'm also extraordinarily concerned about people shutting down research that is questions of curiosity, basic science. We should not do that. Or study of areas where you may not see an immediate impact because it's human knowledge that's being passed down. And you know how many times, maybe the most accessible for people is the famous 3M Post-it note that came out of time to go play. And now it's ubiquitous, I would say. As a relatable example, you're right. This cannot be an either or. This is, let's broaden the tent of what it means to do impactful research.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the President's and Chancellor's Council on Public Impact Research, I had been under the impression this was very much based in the US, but you've mentioned that you've had people involved from Canada, from the UK. Is this an international project? Have I misunderstood that?
We certainly have membership from Canada, so it's a North America base, but in June of 24, when we all convened and started talking about it, we had representation from the UK as well. We do not currently on the council itself. It's a North America focus, but it's been fascinating since the word has gotten out that we are doing this. I hear from people worldwide because this question of our identity as universities, what kind of culture are we creating? Are we open to multiple perspectives? That's what we preach, but are we truly doing it? Seems to be a global concern. So we'd love for it to be much broader. But in terms of the culture, the incentives, promotion and tenure system, how do we count these? Currently, our membership is North America based.
Yeah, and that makes sense given that you're working on these recommendations.
That global perspective is also coming from the funders. When I say we first met, we certainly had big funders from the UK there as well. Because as you say, the concern is not just coming from universities, but for philanthropists around the world that are saying, we want to figure out how to evaluate the work that's coming out of the efforts that we fund.
Of course, that makes sense. Just on the recommendations, when might people expect to hear more on those?
The plan right now, by August 26th, you will be able to see something from us.
And that would be a framework to facilitate individual researchers, but also institutions to really drive this public impact research forward.
Correct. It's really for the institutions also to think about what can we do in those three areas that we talked about. We also hope to do lots and lots of outreach to professional organizations, for example. Ultimately, when you think about tenure and promotion, these are activities where the professional organizations have a big impact on what is respected, what's valued, how is it evaluated. So this is to do outreach to the ecosystem. Currently, we have government agencies, we have funders, we have a group of universities. This is not to tell anybody else what they should do in their university, but rather to showcase places where it seems to be done well and some obstacles and some ideas for addressing them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Neeli. It's been fascinating talking to you. And I think many people listening to this will be really heartened to hear about these supportive efforts focused on getting the impact of the work in universities out there for everyone to see.
It's been a delight to speak to you.
So there you are. That's a clear message from Neeli to get in touch and get involved if this is something you are interested in. You could help shape the future of public impact research in the US and beyond. For more advice on getting the public engaged in your research, we have a spotlight guide dedicated to this topic, drawing together insight from academics all over the world on how to manage citizen science projects, participatory research, collaborations, co-production, and much more. You will find that at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. As always, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please like and share. We'll be back with you soon. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.